Kia ora and welcome to this episode of Shared Lunch, where we lift the lid on the weight loss drug boom in the US. It's been big business for pharmaceutical companies for a while, but how do investors know if it's a fad or whether there's promise? I'm your host, Helen Mattison, and I'll be discussing this with Dr Deborah Lambie, Global Equities Analyst at Milford Asset Management.
Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording.
Great to have you on the program, Deb, after your trip to America.
Yeah, it was much warmer in the States. I actually spent quite a significant portion of the time in Vegas. So it was about 35 degrees when I was there, which was really nice. A bit of a shock to come back to the cold, rainy Auckland, but hopefully it doesn't last too long winter here.
Now, Deb, let's start with what you do at Milford and the reason for your trip to the US, which I understand included seeing a number of pharmaceutical companies.
So at Milford, I'm in the global equities team, which means I'm not looking at companies in New Zealand or Australia. Rather, I'm focused on listed companies that are based in the US, in Japan and in Europe. And you mentioned my trip to the US, so travelling and getting on the road is an important part of what we do. And I've just spent 2 weeks, a pretty whirlwind couple of weeks in the US. The first 7 days I visited 7 cities and drank much more coffee than is probably healthy for me. And then the trip itself comprised of a few independent days where I visited companies by myself and then visiting 2 conferences. So one was a global biopharma conference and then one was a global healthcare investing conference. And I guess you also ask, why is it important to do this? So when I go and visit a company and talk to the management team, I'm going to be testing the assumptions that I have about the company. So is what we believe about that company correct? Looking for risks that we may not be aware of. And then also thinking about how is the management team thinking about opportunities and then also challenges that it's facing. And it's not just about visiting companies that we already invest in, but it's also about visiting companies or hearing from companies that might be a new company to invest in. So it's a great source of new ideas as well.
Now, it'd be good to actually put in context the size of the pharmaceutical industry in the US. I mean, the numbers are eye-watering from Australia and New Zealand's perspective, but also maybe the future and the potential that this sector has.
Yeah. So the pharmaceutical industry itself and the US pharmaceutical industry itself it's massive. So more than $500 billion per year is the size of the industry, which that to kind of put that in context, that's bigger than the GDP of countries like Austria and Norway, and that's more than twice the GDP of us here in New Zealand. And then if you think about, though, of course, the US technology industry, that's a whopping 1.7 trillion. So it's smaller than that, but it is for something that's essentially mostly selling small white pills, it's pretty big numbers. And then you also asked about, I guess, like future growth. So the pharmaceutical industry itself, it's forecast to grow about 5% per annum through to 2030. And that's driven by a few factors, but one that I would really call out is this aging population and changing demographics that we have. And that's not just in the US, but that's also here in New Zealand. And so if you think about our population of people over 60, that's forecast to double by 2050. And then the number of people that are aged over 80, that's actually going to triple by 2050. So that means a much greater proportion of people that need medicines for their chronic conditions and also to manage their quality of life.
I suppose too with medicines, one thing investors really need to think about too if they're looking at such sectors is that it takes a while for a medicine to be developed and go through all the tests and the regulation, etc.
That's exactly right. And the pharmaceutical industry itself, and for me as an investor learning about it, it's quite a kind of complicated industry. And for companies itself, getting a medicine on the market is both time consuming and expensive. So to have a medicine approved for use, it has to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, and then the approval process. And that's very expensive. And I think from memory, it costs around $2 billion per drug that's approved on average.
Wow.
On average, it takes about 10 years. And then also, if you look at that whole process, a lot of medicines fall out along the way. So around only 7% of molecules that start at phase 1 make it all the way through to phase 3 clinical trials. And then, of course, once you have that medicine approved, so the regulator gives it a tick, it says that it's safe and effective in patients, then what happens is that it's given a period of loss of exclusivity on the market. And what that means is that copycats can't come in and copy the medicine, but that only has a finite life. And so that's on average 10 years. And so after 10 years, what happens is then other companies can copy that molecule and produce what's called a generic medicine. So then at that point in time, then what we see is the price of the drug falls rapidly. So normally to the tune of 70%, and revenue from that molecule falls away. So that means that pharma companies are on this kind of wheel of having to make new drugs, which then have a period of exclusivity, and then that revenue drops right away. So for drug companies to continue to grow, they have to be continually innovating and have medicines coming through that pipeline over time.
Gosh, quite a juggle then, actually. Jumping into weight loss drugs, I mean, they have been talked about a lot. There's a fair bit of hype. Why do you think it has sort of struck a chord?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting one. And one of the companies that I actually visited on the trip was Eli Lilly, which is one of the leaders in the weight loss race.
Yeah.
And there's been heaps of focus on the weight loss phenomenon recently, despite the fact that weight loss medicines have actually been around for quite a long time. And so they were initially developed for use in diabetes to help people manage their weight and blood sugar levels. But what's driven the excitement over the past kind of 12 months is new research that has shown that these medicines provide benefit not just in people who have diabetes, which is around 5% of the population, but also in people who are overweight or obese, which means that the pool of people that can use them jumps from that 5% to 33% of the population. And then the other really important thing that's been shown in these clinical studies is not only do these medicines provide a benefit in terms of the weight loss, but also they provide other health benefits. So if you take these medicines for a period of time, it will reduce your risk of heart attack, it will reduce your risk of stroke, it will reduce the progression of your kidney disease, it will reduce the pain if you have arthritis. So it's the combination of now proving out that it's a much broader pool of people that can benefit from them, and then also that the benefit extends beyond that of weight loss alone.
What about, though, if you stop taking these drugs? I mean, they've got all those other aspects and benefits by the sounds of things, but do you have to stay on them forever?
And yeah, this is a really good question. And it's actually something that investors are debating. But what the trials show so far is that, to your point, to keep the weight loss off, you have to stay on these medicines. And as soon as you stop taking the medicine, slowly but surely, the weight comes back on. And so they're self-administered injections, and they essentially work by making you feel full and suppressing your appetite. And so when you're no longer taking them, that means that you don't feel that fullness. Your appetite comes back, and then slowly but surely, that weight will just come back on.
What about the side effects, though? There seems to be always side effects with drugs, no matter what you take.
Yeah, I think that's true. And so there is side effects with these medicines, but so far the evidence is that they're generally pretty well tolerated. And the main side effects are things like nausea, upset stomach, and that kind of thing. But there hasn't been anything so far that would be a really risky side effect that people have to be worried about.
Given these new weight loss drugs, I mean, how much weight can you actually lose on them? And also, what is the bar for obesity?
So currently, all the research has been done in people that have a BMI over 27. So that's classified as overweight or obese. So they're not for use in people who are a normal weight or a healthy weight range, which is BMI 18 to 24. And then what we see is if you take these medicines for a year, on average, the average person will lose between 15 to 20% of their body weight. So if you take Novo Nordisk's Ozempic, you lose on average 15%. And Eli Lilly's medicines, interesting, are slightly more effective, and you'll lose an average 20% of your body weight. And what we're seeing is that next generation versions of the drug that are currently in earlier clinical trials, they're showing a similar safety profiles, but losing more like 25% of your body weight.
So what about in this part of the world? Can you actually get hold of these medicines, or is that some way off?
Yeah, so far what we've seen is that Novo Nordisk medicine, Ozempic, that has been approved for use in both diabetes and obesity. But Eli Lilly's medicine so far has just been approved for use in diabetes, but not yet obesity. So the company is going through that approval process now. And then another thing that's important to keep in mind is that even though they're approved for use here and in Australia, they're not yet funded. So in New Zealand, it's not funded by Pharmac. So that means that if you are prescribed that medicine, you are paying out-of-pocket costs yourself to take that medicine, and those are expensive. So around $1,000 per person per month just to take the medicine. And then the other factor to layer on top of this as well is that there's been massive global shortages of the medicine. So in Australia, they've been able to get their hands on a little bit of supply, but here in New Zealand, there's been very little, if not any, people able to take it so far.
And what about the pricing? If there's supply and demand, wouldn't it go up and you'd be paying more again?
And it's kind of interesting because in most markets, you would expect that really high demand with a constrained supply, that you would see prices go up, especially in the short term until more supply comes online. But in the pharma market, when the drug is approved, prices are negotiated at that point in time, and so they're set. And then what you see is over time, generally the price of medicines actually will come down a little bit over time. So this means maybe while we're supply constrained in the near term, that prices will be able to stay a little bit higher. So there'll be less pricing pressure over time, but we still expect that over time prices will come down.
Now, Deb, you're a medical doctor. You aren't practicing at the moment. I think you've been out for about 7 years. But what do you think? Would you be prescribing these medicines given what you know?
Yeah, so 7 years, it's time does really fly. But I would say, so based on what I know, my understanding is there's a really good base of evidence to show that these demonstrate good health benefits in people over a sustained period of time when they take them. And also basically that the risks are pretty small. Side effect profile is good. So I, with the caveat that I'm not currently practicing, I see no reason why I wouldn't prescribe these.
Now, let's look at some of the companies involved in this weight loss drug race, if you like. There's some pretty big ones and some pretty big numbers, as we've just discussed. It'd be quite good, too, to see how their share prices have performed, given this new theme, if you like.
So the two main leaders in the weight loss race are Eli Lilly, who's the US company that I visited while I was on my trip. And then also there's a Danish company called Novo Nordisk. And that is a Danish company. And so what we've seen is that all of this new information has driven really strong share price performance over the past year. So shares in Eli Lilly are up around 92%, I think, last time I checked. And then shares in Novo Nordisk up around 70%. So it's been pretty stellar performance. And it's also meant that these companies, they're now pretty big companies. And so to put it into context, if you look at the size of these two companies combined, and then you compare it to all 181 companies that we have listed on our New Zealand Stock Exchange, these two companies are worth more than 13 times all of our listed companies combined.
At the same time, the prices might be high. I'm not sure whether you've looked at the price to earnings ratio, which is obviously what investors use as a sometimes fairly blunt instrument to understand whether you're getting value. There's that, but they're also spending a fair bit of capex or capital to actually bring these medicines to market, aren't they?
And so I guess on the PE ratios, if you look at what Eli Lilly is trading on relative to Novo Nordisk, relative to other pharma companies, these are on eye-watering multiples. So they look optically pretty expensive. They do have a great growth opportunity ahead of them, but to your point, they are also spending a lot. And the kind of manufacturing of these is very complicated. And I think combined by 2028, it's expected that they will spend around $50 billion on capex. And so one of the debates that investors are kind of thinking about is, are the shares getting overvalued? Because while the growth opportunity is very exciting, I guess in my mind, there's no debating the opportunity. The key debate is really the valuation and then how much of that is reflected in the valuation of these shares.
Now, we've talked about valuation in terms of thinking about investing in this sector, and there's probably a number of other things that investors need to think about. There's the exclusivity, there's the time it takes to actually get a medicine to market. Are there other issues that have been brought up with this new theme, if you like?
Yeah, And I think with these pharma companies specifically and the weight loss opportunities specifically, putting valuation aside, the key questions would be price. So how long will the price stay at $1,000 per person per month? And what will the price be in 2030? And then what will the price be when other competitors bring their products to market? Because competition is on the horizon. Also, another debate is, will people want to stay on these medicines for life? Because as we know, you stop taking the medicine, the weight comes back on. That's a massive commitment for someone to be taking either an injection currently every week for a month or an oral pill for life. And the third is, given the high price point of the medicines currently, will governments and health systems want to pay for them or be able to pay for them? Because if you think about it, if it's 1 in 3 Kiwis are classified as overweight or obese, so could benefit from these medicines, and if it costs currently $1,000 per person per month, and you sum that up, that's a massive cost for our healthcare system. So the price it's like, where does the price land? And then how does that impact the proportion of people that are on the medicine? Are kind of key debates that investors are focusing on.
Another thing I think investors probably need to think about too is, are they a one-show pony? I mean, hopefully a pharmaceutical company has got a few strings to its bow. For example, Eli Lilly, I think, is also getting an Alzheimer's drug toward market production, aren't they?
Yes, and it's a key difference between Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. Is Novo Nordisk is currently, it's basically solely focused on diabetes and weight loss medicines, whereas Eli Lilly is a much more diversified company. So not only does it have its weight loss medicine, it's got an Alzheimer's medicine coming. It also has an oncology portfolio. So they're quite two different companies when you think about what sits in them. And then the Alzheimer's opportunity, that's something that investors have been pretty focused on for a while now. There's currently 2 main companies, so Eli Lilly, and there's also a US company called Biogen, which has been kind of like vying to get in the Alzheimer's market. And Biogen has had a few controversies along the way with its Alzheimer's medicine. The first was approved back in 2021. And this was controversial because it was the first disease-modifying Alzheimer's treatment. And so that means that it works to reduce the progression of the actual disease. But the approval was controversial because it just showed improvement in the scans of brains of people with Alzheimer's, but it didn't actually prove that it improved their symptoms. And so there are a number of people that actually resigned from the FDA, which is a regulatory body on the back of that. And then they were also very criticised because of the high price point that the medicines were priced at that point when they were approved, which I think from memory was around $56,000 per person per year. So that's much higher price than the weight loss drugs, for example. But then, so Biogen, they've got a new CEO's come in. They've since had a subsequent version of the medicine that's been approved that does show improvement in symptoms of people with Alzheimer's disease. And then also what we've seen is that they've cut the price dramatically. It's still expensive. I think it's maybe $26,000 per person per year, which is a lot. But it's come down from that $56,000.
Fascinating. I think Alzheimer's and the drugs and the race is probably a whole episode in itself, Deb, which I think we'll probably come back to. Just getting back to manufacturing these pharmaceuticals, has AI had much of a place here in terms of speeding things up?
So this AI kind of in pharma companies and in drug discovery, it's been a topic that investors are kind of increasingly focused on and increasingly excited about. And one of the key kind of themes or takeaways I would say that I really noticed when I was in the US is just how excited companies are about the use of AI in drug discovery, because we've already talked about how time-consuming and expensive it is to develop new medicines. And what we've seen is that the developments in AI mean that you can develop new molecules around 10 times as fast, or so you can design new molecules around 10 times as fast. You can run simulations on those molecules around 100 times as fast. And then there's this new concept, which I think is pretty interesting. You've heard of the concept of a self-driving car. There's this new concept of a self-driving lab. And so what this means is that you have AI and then you have robotics. And so you use AI and robotics together, and they drive the cycle of kind of prediction, experimentation, and analysis, which means that you can iteratively identify new compounds, which you then run experiments on, which then mean that the whole process is much faster and then importantly, more cost effective for companies.
Gosh, so do we have any idea how much that would speed things up? We talked about 10 years before being the time that it can take, I think, for exclusivity, but I think, when you've got a medicine in the wings, that can take even longer, can't it?
Yeah, and I think it's probably too early yet to put an actual number on how much it could speed things up. But I think what we're seeing is more and more companies are talking about it, more and more companies are using it in their drug discovery process. So I think over time we'll be able to get a better sense of how much time it actually is taking off the drug discovery process. But to the extent that it means we can develop medicines that are cheaper, I feel like that could only be a good thing given the high costs of healthcare that we're seeing around the world.
Now, just thinking about investors looking to invest in this sector, I mean, there are those direct stocks. They are probably quite expensive at the moment for some people. But also, what about ETFs? I know on Sharesies, for instance, we've got about 5, or at least there's more actually, pharmaceutical ETFs that people can look to. They are mainly in the US. But also, I did see that there was a couple of applications for more themed weight loss ETFs by, I think, Amplify and Roundhill Investments were two, though I don't think they've actually come to fruition yet.
So I guess when you're thinking about healthcare itself is super broad. And then within that, there's all different kinds of companies. So hospitals, medical device companies that sell chemicals that are used in pharma, companies that sell tools that are used in pharma. So all of that kind of sits in the broader healthcare space. And I think if you're thinking about getting a broad kind of ETF exposure, maybe one way to get a sense of what could be better is looking back at what's happened over time. And if you look back over a significant period of time, say 20 years, the S&P 500 index and the S&P Healthcare Index have actually interestingly performed basically neck on neck. So they both generated around a 10% return per year over a 20-year time horizon. If you look at pharma itself, that generated around 0.5% lower return, so around 9.5% over that 20-year period of time. But if you had managed to pick pharma winner Novo or pharma winner Eli Lilly over that period of time, you would have generated, I think from memory, it's around a 16% return per annum and then a 25% return per annum. Picking a winner can be great, but then if you're looking at a diversified exposure, history would suggest that rather than looking for a narrow pharma exposure, a broader healthcare exposure would be better. And then I think especially worth keeping in mind with a diversified ETF for pharma, you're likely to have a higher exposure to the largest companies, and they may have a higher proportion of medicines that are coming up to that loss of exclusivity and revenue dropping off. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind with pharma itself, is what is that loss of exclusivity burden and how does that sit across the companies that are in that ETF?
Well, we could talk for ages, Deb. There's so much to unpack here. But look, thanks so much for your insights today and coming in, even though you have got a cold.
Thanks so much for having me. No, it's been awesome to be here.
And thanks to everyone for joining in. But before you go, we'd be really keen if you could fill out our audience survey, which you'll find in the show notes. It'll only take a few minutes and you'll be in the draw to win $50 to invest. So stay warm and stay safe, and we'll see you next time on Shared Lunch.